Everyone out there says that the 1970s were some of the best years to be alive. The music, the culture, and the car scene were all converging into an era that was truly fantastic, yet also one of a kind. The early 70s brought the last hurrah of the high horsepower muscle car era, and the late 70s brought us into a whole new era of automotive styling. It was a super transitory period in the car industry, which meant that plenty of experiments were being done with some very interesting cars with some wild quirks to see what would become the next big thing. And these are the 6 wackiest cars of the 70s that you need to know about. Number 6, the Bricklin SV1. Launched in 1974 at a time when safety regulations and oil crises had sapped the soul out of American performance cars, the Bricklin SV1 burst onto the scene like an alien spacecraft made of idealism and acrylic plastic. Conceived by maverick entrepreneur Malcolm Bricklin, the SV1, which was short for Safety Vehicle 1, promised to be the world's first sports car focused on occupant protection and safety, which was quite a strange premise. It's a sports car, so sure you want it to be reasonably safe, but at the end of the day, most people would have rathered it just be a better sports car. If you wanted safety, just go buy a Volvo. Nonetheless though, underneath this space-age styling, the SV1 did pack a lot of unique features like a built-in rollover bar and its own advanced 5-mile-per-hour shock-absorbing bumpers, all wrapped in a radical 2-layer acrylic over fiberglass body that never needed paint. Colors were literally baked into the top of plastic panels that sat above the fiberglass, until they started to fade and delaminate. And that's because there were plenty of production woes because of this unique design. But the real quirks of the Bricklin lie in its contradictions. It featured heavy hydraulically operated gull-wing doors that looked cool but often refused to open, sometimes leaving drivers stranded inside for minutes at a time. Each door weighed a staggering 90 pounds and took 12 seconds to raise when the hydraulics worked. I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound too safe to me. Performance for these cars was modest. Early AMC 360 V8 powered models made about 220 horsepower, but later Ford 351 versions had power drop to just 175 horsepower, and those were only paired with a 3-speed auto, whereas a 4-speed manual was available at some point with the AMC motor. Worse still, these cars were assembled in New Brunswick, Canada, by workers who had no prior automotive experience, which contributed to dreadful build quality. Just under 3,000 of these cars were built before the company collapsed in 1976. To be frank, this was just a strange car. It didn't look bad, but its need to be different drove up costs excessively to the tune of nearly a $10,000 MSRP in 1975, which put it out of novelty range and into the serious money category. Number 5, the Citroen SM. In an era when French cars were expected to be quirky but rarely fast, the Citroen SM arrived like a spaceship designed as a grand tourer. It was Citroen's audacious attempt to build a high-speed luxury GT that could rival Jaguar and Aston Martin, except it was front-wheel drive, was suspended by a complex hydraulic fluid suspension system, and was powered by a Maserati engine, specifically a compact 2.7-liter V6, which had an uncharacteristically beautiful exhaust note for this weird French car. The end result was a car that looked like a rolling sculpture, drove like a velvet missile, and demanded the patience of a trained technician to maintain it. Literally everything about the SM defied normal. It had self-leveling, corner-swiveling headlights that were operated via rods and hydraulics to give maximum nighttime visibility for the driver, because regular headlights just weren't effective enough apparently. Then there was the steering system, called Diravi or DIR-AVI, which was an adjustable speed steering system that changed the weight of the steering depending on the speed that the vehicle was going. And in places like parking lots, you literally only needed like one finger to turn the wheel. But what really threw people off about it was how fast and how sensitive it was. The steering only needed 2 full turns from all the way left to all the way right, whereas most cars would take 4 turns. That meant that the SM responded instantly to even the slightest movement of the wheel, and for drivers used to a more relaxed steering setup, it felt twitchy and strange. The brakes were activated by a floor-mounted rubber mushroom instead of a pedal, offering millimeters of travel between serenity and whiplash. And then there was the suspension. The SM used Citroen's complicated hydropneumatic system from their other car, the DS, which meant that the car ditched normal springs and shocks for this wacky setup that used nitrogen gas and hydraulic fluid to enhance ride quality. Beyond that, it also had the ability to self-level the suspension depending on how much weight was in the car. Inside, oval gauges and ribbed bucket seats made the cabin feel more like a mid-century cigar lounge than a 70s car. Despite a sensational debut and accolades like Motor Trend's 1972 Car of the Year, the SM was simply too far ahead of its time and too high maintenance for the market. Mechanics unfamiliar with its intricate and needy Maserati V6 engine often overlooked crucial maintenance items like cam chain adjustments, which led to often catastrophic engine failures. US regulations also killed the swiveling headlights and eventually the car itself when Citroën could not meet the new bumper laws. Only about 12,900 of these cars were ever built, but man oh man was this thing certifiably crazy. Number 4. The Bond Bug. If the 1970s were about standing out, then the Bond Bug absolutely nailed that assignment. Shaped like a cheese wedge from another planet and painted only in blazing tangerine orange, the Bond Bug was Britain's most eccentric attempt to sell young people a fun, sporty microcar that had just 3 wheels. Designed by industrial designer Tom Caron and underpinned with a chassis from race car expert John Crosswaith, the Bug was built by Reliant after they acquired the Bond Cars company. It borrowed much of its mechanical DNA from the Reliant Regal 3-wheeler, including the 700cc and later 750cc inline-4 engines, which made up to 30 horsepower. What made the Bond Bug truly unique was everything. Entry to the car was done through a lift-up front canopy, which included the windshield and side windows in one futuristic-looking panel. Drivers would step into the cockpit rather than open a conventional door. Inside, depending on trim, you might get luxuries like side window screens that closed, a heater, or even a racing steering wheel in the top-spec 700 ES or 750 ES versions. But even with the fanciest upgrades, you were still straddling a protruded engine cowl in a cramped plastic-bodied shell, all for the joy of hitting a top speed of around 78 miles per hour. Not bad for a 3-wheel go-kart pretending to be a sports car. But as bold as it was, the Bug never really caught on the way that Reliant had hoped. With only 2,200 units being built from 1970 to 1974, it was more of a cult classic than a commercial success, compared to the Reliant Regal, which it was based on, that sold around 100,000 vehicles in total, which certainly wasn't bad for a car missing a wheel. Number 3. The Marcos Mantis M70. Of the oddballs born from Britain's low-volume sports car scene, few of them are like the Marcos Mantis M70, and not necessarily for the reasons that its creators hoped. This radical 4-seat Grand Tourer was a bold move by Marcos, a small but spirited sports car company best known for their lightweight 2-seaters. The Mantis was their first attempt at building something larger and more practical. With its massive fiberglass wedge body, the Mantis looked like a concept car that somehow escaped onto public roads. It had sharp angular lines, a tall greenhouse, and muscular rear haunches. It was a cocktail of 1970s design excess that either captivated or confused at first glance. And to be fair, most people, including myself, find the car downright ugly. Beneath its wild exterior, the Mantis M70 packed a 2.5-liter Triumph inline-6, borrowed from the TR6, mated to a 4-speed manual gearbox and producing right around 150 horsepower. And thanks to the Mantis's ultra-lightweight body, which itself weighed just 250 pounds, including the doors, the hood, and the trunk, gave the car an excellent power-to-weight ratio. In fact, the car tipped the scales about 600 pounds lighter than a Jaguar E-Type, even though dimensionally it was longer, wider, and meant to carry 4 adults in relative comfort. With a perfect 50-50 weight distribution and 2,500 pound curb weight, plus long suspension travel and relaxed gearing, this car was designed as a high-speed GT, not a corner-carving sports car like Marcos had become famous for. It still was a parts bin special though, using parts from a Ford Capri for the rear suspension and whatever other off-the-shelf parts that Marcos could get to keep costs down. Still though, the MSRP on the Mantis M70 got dangerously close to that of an E-Type Jag, which was a much better looking and much better overall car. Just about 30 of these Mantis M70s were built before Marcos went belly up, and the Mantis M70 project was sold onto a different firm who never did much with it, leaving just a small handful of these weird wedges out there. Number 2. The Citicar. Long before Teslas roamed the earth and decades before electric cars were taken seriously, there was the Citicar, a tiny wedge-shaped electric car built in the sun-drenched town of Sebring, Florida. It was the improbable creation of Bob Beaumont, a former Chrysler dealer turned EV pioneer, who looked at the gas crisis of the early 70s and thought, well, what if a golf cart could save the American commuter? The result was the Citicar, a 2-seat all-electric microcar that looked like a doorstop and drove about as fast as one. But for a brief bizarre moment, it was the best-selling electric car in America since World War II. The original Citicar SV36 model debuted in 1974, powered by a 36-volt battery pack and a 2.5 horsepower GE motor, with a body made from impact-resistant ABS plastic and sporting a lightweight aluminum frame. This little car weighed just about 1,200 pounds. The top speed was a modest 25 to 28 miles per hour, and the range was about 40 miles from an 8-hour charge. While minimal by any standard, this urban pod was meant for short, efficient trips, not highway hauls. Later versions, like the SV48, upgraded to a 48-volt battery pack and a 3.5 horsepower motor, pushing speeds to about 38 miles per hour, while the final transitional models received a whopping 6 horsepower motor and safety improvements like better doors, heater vents, and a rear hatch for accessing the 12 cubic foot cargo area. Despite its crude simplicity, leaf spring suspension, direct gear drive, and drum brakes, the Citicar struck a chord during its short production run. And by 1976, in fact, Sebring Vanguard was America's 6th largest automaker, behind only the big three, AMC and Checker. About 2,300 Citicars were built before the company folded in 1977, after which the design was revised under the Commuta-Car brand until 1982. Including all variants, more than 4,400 units were produced, a record for American electric cars that stood until the modern era. Awkward, slow, and unapologetically weird, the Citicar wasn't just ahead of its time, it was from a different timeline entirely, one where minimalism and necessity briefly overpowered horsepower and style. And last but not least, number 1, the Leata Caballero. If the 1970s gave us a parade of bizarre, misguided automotive experiments, the Leata Caballero might just be its grand marshal. Born in Post Falls, Idaho, from the dreams and perhaps delusions of a machinist and inventor named Don Steinbaugh. The The Caballero aimed to be a luxury compact that elevated the humble Chevy Chevette into a personal luxury car for the downsizing era. What it became instead, though, was a masterclass in automotive absurdity. Based on the GM T-Car platform, the Caballero kept the Chevette's underwhelming 52 horsepower four-cylinder. It kept the brake stock, and pretty much the whole chassis was the same. They then buried it under 350 pounds of new fiberglass body panels, vinyl roof appliques, padded opera windows, and faux upscale trim. It was the automotive equivalent of putting a tuxedo on a garden gnome and charging $10,000 for it in the 70s, which is nearly 40 grand in today's money for what was essentially a Nissan Leaf with some appearance mods. Inside, the Caballero doubled down on the madness. The interior featured cloth-covered dash pockets, upgraded upholstery, cruise control, and a second gauge cluster housing, half of which was hidden behind a curtain because, well, why not? Don added chrome flourishes, plush carpeting, and options like power windows and air conditioning to try and justify the insane price tag. And this wasn't just a one-off experiment either. A pickup truck version of the Caballero was also made using a custom frame, and supposedly at least one convertible left the workshop as well. In the end, somehow, they built 97 of these cars, including 3 pickups and the one mystical cabriolet. Marketed optimistically as the pride of Idaho, the Caballero quickly faded into obscurity, derided by critics and forgotten by history, until it re-emerged decades later to win Worst in Show at the Concours des Lemons in 2014. Today, the Caballero is a rare collector's oddity, a rolling artifact of an era that tried to cram luxury into every shape and size. But that wraps up our list of the 6 quirkiest cars from the 70s. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you made it this far, smash the like button and comment down below on which of these cars on the list was your favorite. I'd love to hear it. But otherwise, until next time, enthusiasts.